Now we're going to get into the unit circle, which is where we start tying in those Cartesian coordinates x and y with circles or radius and angles. So let's go ahead and see how we can kind of relate those two things together using trig functions. When we talk about the unit circle, we're talking about a circle with a radius of 1. And to be honest, we're just choosing the radius to be 1. It could be anything and those trig values wouldn't change because remember, trig values are dependent on an angle. They're not dependent on size. So really we could pick the radius to be anything, and there are some arguments as to why we would want to pick the radius to be something else. The main one being that radians have pi in them. If you chose the radius to be something else, you wouldn't have to deal with pi when you're dealing with those values. We're not going to get into that discussion right now, but let's see how we can relate angles to x's and y's. So first off, you'll notice that I already drew out my radius of 1, and I kind of have the different angles here, and then I have some random point, xy. And what that's telling us is if I were to draw out a right triangle here, this side is x, and this side is y. So now I'm going to go ahead and write out our trig functions. And I'm also going to label the sides based off of our angle. So opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. Now that we have all these labeled, let's remember the fact that the denominator of both sine and cosine is the hypotenuse, which in this case is just 1 because we're dealing with a unit circle. And that's really why we do this. It makes the trig values real easy to find. And based off that, we now know that sine, which is the opposite side, or y, of an angle, is just going to be equal to y when we're dealing with the unit circle. And cosine is just the adjacent side, or in this case, x, which means that when we're dealing with the unit circle, cosine of theta is just equal to x. Well, tangent is just the opposite side, y, over the adjacent side, x. So in other words, when we're dealing with the unit circle, we know that sine is just equal to the y part of our coordinate. Cosine is just equal to the x part of our coordinate. And tangent is just equal to the ratio of those two things, y over x. And that's it. That's the basis of the unit circle. The great thing about this is now that we know how to relate angles to coordinates, we can very easily scale this up. The radius is 1, and turning 1 into any number or any size we want is super easy. If we want to turn 1 into a 5, we multiply it by 5. 1 into a 27.2, multiply it by 27.2. This is the basis for vectors, which is one of the most important concepts in physics. And now you got it.